Hello, everyone. Welcome to LSE, to you here in the room and to those of you joining us online via Zoom. My name is Denisa Kostovicova. I'm professor of global politics at the European Institute that is putting on this event. This event is part of our Beyond Eurocentrism program. And within this program, we are rethinking how European politics, political economy, and culture needs to be rethought in terms of exhaustion of Eurocentrism. In other words, employing critical perspectives, but also looking beyond Europe and critically examining the consequences on the broader world. Tonight, we turn to the pursuit of justice for war crimes against the backdrop of atrocities unfolding in real time in Gaza, Israel, Ukraine, South Sudan, and beyond, Yemen, Myanmar. These urgent calls for accountability echo countless similar appeals across history following conflicts near and far. The contexts differ and the form of violence vary, but the demands of those who suffered have remained constant. And these are demands for justice, for redress, and for recognition of victimhood. So justice is not just about acknowledging victims and survivors. It signals to everyone that certain acts are intolerable and that moral boundaries exist. And it also serves as a warning, as a deterrent against future violence. But the question is this really so? Does justice in practice lives up to these expectations? This and many other questions are the ones that we will discuss with Steve Crawshaw, and I cannot imagine a better informed interlocutor on these issues. Steve is the author of Prosecuting the Powerful, War Crimes and the Battle of Justice, this book that you've seen being sold in front of the room. And he will join me in conversation first, and then we'll open up the conversation and include you. Steve is the author of this and a few other books, and it was quite nice to hear that Prosecuting the Powerful has recently been shortlisted for the 2025 Moore Prize in Human Rights Writing. And it's also been translated in German and Polish, and Arabic, Japanese, and other editions will appear next year. Until 2023, Steve was Policy and Advocacy Director at Freedom from Torture. Before that, he worked for Human Rights Watch as UK Director and UN Advocacy Director, and for Amnesty International as International Advocacy Director and Director of the Office of the Secretary General. He joined The Independent at launch, and his roles included Russia and East Europe, and he was also East Europe editor and chief foreign correspondent. Steve was also spent some time at the LSE as a visiting fellow at the Center for the Study of Human Rights in 2016. He is the author of other notable books, including Goodbye to the USSR, Easier Fatherland, Germany and the 21st Century, Small Acts of Resistance, and Street Spirit, the Power of Protest and Mischief. Steve studied Russian and German at universities of Oxford and St. Petersburg, and lived in Poland between 1978 and 1981. Please give a warm welcome to our speaker tonight. Okay, so just before we start, just to remind you to please turn off your phones, and just to let you know that the event is being recorded, and we will make the podcast available unless there are some technical difficulties. So, Steve, I'll start with the first question. and it will be a question maybe out of curiosity, and that is, what is it that brings you to work and dedicate your career to issues concerning justice and war crimes? This is not the easiest of pursuits. It's not an easy career. And reading your book, what comes across from that book is that you smell the suffering and war, not just metaphorically, but actually in a number of places. And as we were discussing about arranging this event, you were just telling me, oh, I'm off to Syria. And you just told me that this is one place where you wanted to go.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for all of you being here. It's a good question, the why. And I guess your summary of my biography includes some of the answers to that. So as a journalist, as you mentioned, I was responsible for some of the East European work, which included the collapse of the Berlin Wall and those joyous moments, really extraordinary moments. I still feel very privileged to have lived through what I saw then in Poland, in East Germany, in Czechoslovakia, and so on. But also shortly after that, of course, came the wars in Croatia, in Bosnia, and the rest of the former Yugoslavia. So I was working as a journalist, was reporting on, as you say, and as you know very well, the sometimes horrific crimes that were happening in that region, driven by politicians who desperately wanted to cling to power, fundamentally, described as some buried ethnic hatreds, and there certainly were instabilities that were there, but fundamentally with a very, very political drive where power was threatened. So that was really interesting to me, and I guess that a really central moment kind of in one of the most extraordinary meetings of my whole life was when I was just back from Sarajevo, from the Bosnian capital, a few months after the war in Bosnia had begun. And there was a peace conference in London. And Slobodan Milosevic, the then Serb leader, was there in his fancy hotel in Knightsbridge. And I'd been half promised, but actually not really quite promised, an interview, and it kind of kept being delayed. Eventually, the conference came to an end. I still hadn't got my interview. I thought, well, I might as well at least try my luck. And so I kind of bluffed my way through some of the stuff in the hotel, managed to get into the presidential suite, and eventually got in to see the man himself. And a war crimes tribunal was just being discussed for the very first time. This was the summer of 1992, which of course would have been the first time since Nuremberg and Tokyo that something like that was really in discussion. So I asked him, I said, what do you think about this idea? And he was very enthusiastic. He thought it was a marvelous idea, and that yes, and if there was any Serb who has committed war crimes, of course he must face trial, which was a complete lie because, of course, actually they were running around and sitting in the Belgrade cafes, the best known criminals at that time. And indeed, he sat on top of so much of it. And I said, what about you? Might you be there? And he acted completely astonished at the very idea that he might ever be there. And reflecting back, so it's one of the most extraordinary couple of hours in my whole life, sitting there sipping whiskey with Milosevic. And what I thought afterwards was, it's interesting, I also didn't believe that he would ever face a trial, would ever land up in the dock. But only, and I think in terms of international justice, we can call it only 9 years later, his very own country, Serbia, he'd been overthrown by his own people, which again, I was privileged to witness as a journalist, having seen his decade of power. I was there when crowds threw him out after he attempted to steal the election of 2000. And then only a few months later, the new democratic government themselves handed him over to The Hague, to this tribunal that had been created a few years earlier. And that, I think, has lots of lessons for today. So that's a very long answer of the first part, how I got interested. And I wrote a magazine cover story for The Independent at a time when people weren't that interested. But I was really interested in the connection between the horrific things that I and so many other journalists had witnessed and the failure by politicians really to respond. And justice seemed a way past that. And shortly after that, I joined Human Rights Watch in 2002, and that was a different turn for me. So my journalistic work was like describing all these things that have happened, just putting them out there, if you like, often on human rights issues. At Human Rights Watch, obviously, like with Amnesty International, your job is to actually help make that change. And so I was again extremely lucky at this really historic moment, just as the International Criminal Court, which had been agreed in Rome a few years earlier, was just coming into being like 3 months after I arrived as London director, as UK director of Human Rights Watch. So then I, as the non-lawyer, but someone really interested in what these justice things actually meant, I became fascinated by this new institution doing things which seem so impossible. And part of the book, as you know, describes these people, they call themselves Don Quixote figures, and they were Don Quixote figures. I'm the man from La Mancha was one of those, Ben Ferrance, one of the key figures who pressed through the wilderness decades, if you like, after 1945. There were these people who said, why don't you just have one Nuremberg for one set of crimes? There should be a global Nuremberg. And none of the governments, of course, wanted that to happen. But it did. In Rome, it was agreed. It came into being just as I arrived at Human Rights Watch, and then later moved to Amnesty International. And both of those organizations achieving some form of justice was an absolutely key element of the work. And both organizations have played an important role in helping the ICC to be created. So it was I found it incredibly engaging. And in some ways, difficult work. I mean, obviously seeing horrible things and talking but it's the others who've gone through the terrible things. And what I found actually both in that work in the human rights organizations, but again, when writing this book, when I traveled 4 times to Ukraine in 2023, and the following year was in Israel and West Bank. More recently, as you say, I was in Syria. And in each of those places, I have found just inspiring people who, against the odds, say, we will get some justice of this kind. Different people have different visions of what that justice should mean. But both in Ukraine and, again, very inspiring, both Israelis and Palestinians. The Israelis feeling fairly embattled within their own society, but really brilliant Israelis who say, without accountability for what's happening, then we can't move forward. So that has interested me so much over the years. And in fact, I started writing a book, which thank God I never wrote, in 2005. So when the International Criminal Court was very newly created. It's called, I've discovered while I was writing the book, I thought I'd lost them. I discovered my notes for what I called Crimes and Punishment. And looking through that proposal, which I never actually submitted, I got too busy. But looking through that, it was way too optimistic because it seemed that the existence of the International Criminal Court meant, okay, we're done, dusted, great, we can all live happily ever after. And of course, as everybody in this room knows very well, actually, it's remained incredibly difficult. So this book, very different from what I might have written 20 years ago, is about the challenge that on the one hand this and on the other hand that, and how do you reconcile those two opposing forces?
This just really neatly brings me to my next question. And just to say that the book is weaves and sort of takes us through the history of the idea of international justice. So it's not just about the contemporary events. And as you said, there are those two opposing forces that you discuss in the book, or sentiments. And these are hope and despair. So maybe if I could ask you, just to flesh it out for us. So where does that, I mean, there is I could never really decide where were you sitting reading the book. So maybe that was exactly the point where, so basically just if you could tell us, where does that hope come from? And why do you despair? Because there is that as well.
So, and the question of which trumps which, I wrestled with constantly while writing, and I continue to wrestle with it now. And I guess any of us who is interested in this subject, we're thinking about it because there's arguments that go in both ways. I think the arguments for hope too often get lost. We'll come to the despair ones in a moment, which are easily visible. But I think it's worth focusing on the hope of, like, lots of things which are happening now, which seemed so unthinkable in so many different ways. Over hundreds of years, there have been changes. You know, the Geneva Conventions beginning in the mid-19th century, the Hague Conventions, and then none of it really went anywhere. Nuremberg, which had its problems, but was also an incredibly important foundation point. And again, the wonderful chief US prosecutor, Robert Jackson, he also used the word Don Quixote. He talks about this quixotic enterprise because people didn't really believe in it. Churchill didn't want Nuremberg. He thought it was useless. He thought it should just be put up against the wall and shot. But various people did argue and say we should have this trial, which did have due process involved with it. There were defendants who got acquitted, which is an important element of Nuremberg. And then the fact that an international criminal court was eventually created, that was deep in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, where these amazing people were saying, we need it to happen. There was the guy who became the Prime Minister and President of Trinidad and Tobago. There was an American lawyer. Both of those two were students at Oxford together and in the early 50s, and continued to dream. All of them, it seemed to go nothing. And then you get to the Rome conference of 1998. America's determined, way before Trump was on the scene. That was Clinton in those days. But America was always determined to crush it and failed to do so, as it has failed to do so far, which we'll come to today. So all of those things happening against the odds, and if we bring it to today, I find incredibly interesting, and I think slightly gets lost in the mix. People quite rightly talk about the unevenness of justice, and obviously that's a problem if we've got it. But when I started writing the book, I started thinking about the book in 2022, even actually just before the Ukrainian full-scale invasion, and then came the full-scale invasion, which changed things again. And then I left Freedom from Torture to write the book at the beginning of 2023 and started my travels. So even as I started talking to people then, people with huge knowledge and understanding said, yeah, but Ukraine is terrible, but you're not going to see an arrest warrant for Putin. Like, that just doesn't happen. Like, obviously you, Steve, understand that that's the way geopolitics is. But actually the prosecutor, and it's not just about an individual prosecutor, because this was the whole court institution, they said, well, look, the crimes are just as serious as anything that's come before us. And Ukraine supported the court's involvement, and the crimes were on the territory of Ukraine. So therefore, under the rules, if you like, unlike with Syria, it was possible for the court to get involved. So as we all know, in 2023, he requested and received an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. That was a very, very big deal. And after it happened, it's like, well, yeah, obviously. Before it happened, I promise you that if you had done a straw poll of lots of leading lawyers, all of them would have explained to you why it just wasn't going to happen, and it did. And the second one, you can all see where this is going, even more startling, that in 2024, as mentioned, in spring, I was there in Israel and West Bank and spoke to some really brilliant lawyers who I trust and like very much, and who spoke very eloquently about why this accountability was needed, but says, but it's not going to happen because, like, it's America. We, Israel, are America's best friend, and like they'd never go for Netanyahu. I had a lot of those conversations, and then in May of that year, arrest warrants, of course, for the Hamas leaders and the atrocities of 7th of October. Like, how could there not be? But also for Netanyahu and his defense minister, Yoav Gallant. So those two things are like, that just could not have happened before. And it's not because we have a new prosecutor, and the court itself has grown stronger. Under the previous prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda from Gambia, things had begun to change. So all of that happening, and there was a slightly distracting conversation, to be honest, about it being only about African leaders, which we can go into if wanted, and many of you will have come across that debate. I would say it goes down some rabbit holes, to be honest, which I say we can discuss if wanted in what way. But crucially, by now, it could no longer possibly be described like that, because on the docket now, Ukraine, Gaza, and very, very interestingly, in terms of, impossible things do happen. Earlier this year, President Duterte of the Philippines, former President Rodrigo Duterte, he was trotting around Hong Kong, boasting, mocking the International Criminal Court, which wanted to arrest him and said, ha, 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 but here I am in Hong Kong, flew over to Manila, and there were the handcuffs, and he was put on a plane. Now, I'm not saying those things will necessarily happen either with a Putin once out of power or with a Netanyahu once out of power. But again, we can discuss that if wanted, because both of those are really interesting questions of how societies change. What we saw most obviously with Serbian society 25 years ago. But those are the questions. That's all my reasons for hope. The despair. The despair is probably more shortly described. We have a man in the Oval Office in Washington who understands nothing except his own desire to destroy justice. He loves impunity in every possible context. He loves it for his friends, he loves it for himself, and he loves it generally. He's even stopped funding of work being done on accountability for Myanmar and Sudan and other places where he doesn't even have a particular interest. But clearly for something like Israel, he is literally ready, with the help of his indicted friend Bibi Netanyahu, to try to destroy the International Criminal Court. And that's not too strong a word, as many of you in the room may be aware, but the details are easily available of the extraordinary tactics, including forcing a very senior British lawyer, the former chief military prosecutor, Andrew Cayley. He left after what he called the most difficult months of my life, having worked in a lot of tough gigs, Cambodia and other war crimes tribunals. The Dutch police, to give just one example, told him he needed to put bars on the skylights and to put a reinforced bulletproof door for his apartment in The Hague. That gives a sense of the kind of pressures this court is under. And we are seeing almost complete silence from European governments, both from this government, which has a very, very human rights-y lawyer as the Attorney General, who was, before he went into politics, was helpful to this book and is very, very human rights concerned. But the government more generally has failed to speak out in defense of the ICC, except mumbling. And likewise, France, Germany, and Poland, just to quote 3 countries, or we can throw in the Netherlands actually, because The Hague is there. Each of those 4 countries in different ways has said, oh, if the indicted war crime suspect Benjamin Netanyahu were to come to my country, I and we would not arrest him. This is about the court, which those indictments were, those arrest warrants were requested and then authorized after six advisors advised the prosecutor, including a very senior former Israeli ambassador who was also the former head of the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal, Theodor Meron, who will be here in this country in January giving a talk. Very, very interesting man. So he and others were advising, then the prosecutor, and then 4 judges all supported this. And yet, this court, which Britain helped to create, Germany helped to create, France helped to create, Poland helped to create, they're sitting on their hands, basically because they're frightened, definitely frightened of Trump, and maybe, which I find no logic to, frightened of the current Israeli leader, who, after all, as we all remember, the Israeli people themselves were about to get rid of if 7th of October hadn't come along, and who in the meantime is indicted. So that is my sense of despair. And so that's that kind of crossroads, really, I think. And I think it's about voices being heard. I still worry that people don't fully grasp the magnitude of the attempts to describe an institution, attempts to destroy an institution which was created to defend the rule of law worldwide. And if the bad guys, especially in Washington, they manage to destroy it, including, for example, by freezing, the financial pressures that can be put on are absolutely huge. So if that happens, then it would be extremely difficult to imagine that institution being recreated. That would be a huge loss for the world. But I haven't heard any of the European leaders speak out in strong terms about that. Sorry, with the exception of magnificent Ireland, Spain, Norway, there's countries which are going against the flow, but those are very much in the minority.
Maybe just to broaden out in terms of the challenges to the court and in general to this global norm of non-impunity. So when we study transitional justice, we look at this end of the Cold War and those decades that have come, the decades of the global liberal order, which basically came with the idea of sort of peace building, right? When we looked at conflict areas, but peace building at the core of which was concerned with justice. So my question to you would be, what we are observing now is a change of that order, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing this global reconfiguration that is not going, it's regressing, right?
Yeah, undoubtedly.
So I was just wondering, even, beyond this conflictual, if you like, relationships that is between the US and many Western allies, and the attacks on the ICC, how can justice survive in that kind of a global, in the new kind of global order that is taking shape as we speak?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it matters so much. As you say, we are seeing this global reconfiguration. The arrival of Trump is obviously not the only thing. There's patterns of Trumpish type figures who either have arrived in power or may do so, and his arrival comforts the others, and then the others are comforted by the others. That there is that growing sense, and that is undoubtedly very, very difficult. I think that both light and darkness sometimes change with surprising speed. So, I mean, I grew up, my hair color, in the depths of the Cold War. I studied, as you briefly referred to, in Russia. It was then Leningrad, but St. Petersburg now. A time when Leonid Brezhnev was in power. He'd sent tanks into Czechoslovakia already a few years before I was there. He sent them into Afghanistan a few years after I was there. And the Cold War was just set. If you read any history book or like any politics book at that time, it's obvious that like we now have a Cold War, and that was like there forever. Things changed, including, and you mentioned briefly, I was so privileged to live in Poland between 1978 and 81. And in this audience, many of you may know what it is, but if you don't know what those years were, I encourage you to look, because it's something which has kind of got lost. You all know about the Berlin Wall. You all know about the freeing of Nelson Mandela. Look what happened in Poland in 1980, where icebergs broke. These days, that's a negative connotation, but in those days, it was a positive connotation that the icebergs were breaking in extraordinary ways that I witnessed. And that was in 1980 and led pretty much directly, again, with civil society pressures, to the Berlin Wall coming down in 89 and so much else. It seemed possible. The 1990s, now it feels very naive looking back. And in a sense, it wasn't naive because it was happening in reality, and it had overturned all the cynics or the skeptics, to use a more neutral word, who said things just can't change. The polls, which I witnessed, like Polish defiance, like, well, you can kill us if you want, but we're going to move forward on this, and they did. And then I saw the same thing in East Germany. I saw the same thing in Czechoslovakia, then one country in Prague. So all of those things created incredible change, and the International Criminal Court was created at that time and of that moment. And by chance, it was literally, I mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, who asked for the UN General Assembly to put International Criminal Court and a statute for it on the books, basically during the very weeks the Berlin Wall was coming down. Now, that was slightly chance that it happened at that time, because he'd been obsessed for decades, but that was a time of such positive change. Now, the likelihood, and everybody in this room has read it and maybe thought it, columnists saying, ha, 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 90s were a time of optimism, that's gone, wake up, grow up, now is the time of darkness. But what this actually tells us is that things go back and forth. And I'm struck by the Martin Luther King quote that all of us know so well, which I'll now garble if I'm not lucky. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That was not a like happy, 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 let's just put the fridge magnet on. This was at the same time that he believed, rightly of course, that he might be assassinated at any time. He knew that he was living in a time of incredible darkness, but he also believed that if enough people push, we can get to a better place, which indeed happened. And I was hearing kind of similar quotes from both Israelis and Palestinians when I was there last year, of like, we're at a place of such darkness now that if we're so dark, it can kind of only turn around and get better. That, of course, is not necessarily true, because sometimes we think it's got darker and it gets even darker. And if you do have a Trump in Washington, all of those things become possible. And what we've got of the ceasefire now is deeply kind of complicated. Let's use the most neutral word. But that's sort of where I think that we do still have things to play for. And I think that what is important to know, which is what I learned so much and was privileged to live through some of that, what Poles and other East Europeans were saying was like, well, you may say this is all fixed, but we need something better than this. And I think it's really interesting and important for all of us to have that sense of, yes, there's a lot of darkness, around. You can make all the comparisons with the 1930s, and none of them feel inappropriate at the moment, unfortunately. They were made already a few years ago, and it was like, yeah, but maybe it's a bit of a stretch. Now, there's lots of tick box on those comparisons between the 30s and now. But we do have agency. We have agency in this country, we have agency throughout Europe, and we actually have agency around the world. There are democracies all around the world, from Latin America to Asia, etc., each of whom can push their democratically elected leaders for making sure that they remain engaged and don't just shrug, because I think that's the most dangerous thing of all. Politicians are liable to shrug, and it's a way of not making sure they don't shrug, if you like. Going back to that thing of the silence of the European leaders on this theme earlier, we've seen, including in recent days, on Ukraine, they're quite capable of finding their voice and saying, no, that's not the way it's going to play out. We would like it to play out like this. They find, quite rightly, some polite language to deal with the crazy guy. But they do find language which says, no, crazy guy, that's not where we're going. And I think we need to find that on justice as well.
So that again brings me exactly to what I wanted to ask, and that has to do with this, I'll call it selectivity. In the book, you mention, you refer to hypocrisy.
Yeah.
So that someone's crimes are seen, others are not. But also brings me to a related question about why transitional justice or international justice, criminal justice, as it's been practiced, on the one hand, has addressed some wrongs, but has also been seen as unfair because of the same principle. Let's say, for example, in much of the global South or the countries that experienced Western intervention, there is this sense that the West hasn't been taken held to account for what was done. So that creates this, this pushback, if you like, from a different perspective against the idea of international justice. And if I may push this even further, referring to the title of your book, you're talking about the powerful. And when you see how crimes happens, we discuss a lot sort of the theories of conflict, the intimacy of violence, right? Where the violence is actually committed by little men, by neighbors, by teachers, right? So it's not just about the powerful. So at some level, that exercise can never really address the enormity of harm.
Yeah. Thank you. Lots of important stuff. So I'll cheat a bit by going backwards, or just because it's most immediately in my mind and not to lose it. The local people, as you say, in former Yugoslavia, clearly the case, but in many conflicts, it's like neighbor against neighbor. As you say, the teacher or the this, that, and the other. It's incredible. The phrase, sometimes controversial, but I have to say, I think it's a brilliant phrase, Hannah Arendt's phrase of the banality of evil, because it's people who are not special at all. They don't have a vision for anything, but they just, with the permissiveness of what's happening, they then gain a bit of power in their own and go and commit these terrible crimes. And especially when the number of crimes has been very great, it's really difficult to work out how to find accountability for that. And it's always going to be quite messy. So Rwanda had the Gacaca courts, which are quite, because there were so many millions of crimes, but it was it was messy in itself, the courts on the grass, the courts on the lawn. And it was an attempt, but it was also problematic itself. In Syria, where I was recently, a few months ago, the same thing is like, not every crime is going to be committed because there were so many people, and somehow you have to kind of move on. For me, I can see that's difficult often for people who suffer, but it's also interesting the conversations I had, especially in Syria, where they were very, very engaged. I went to a community center meeting in a room pretty much this size, but absolutely packed in a destroyed area of Damascus, where it was, this was no intellectual, like, what does traditional transitional justice mean? These were people, all of whom knew that it mattered to have some kind of justice, however they understood it. And different people understood it in different ways, but a very, very energized and energetic discussion for people who'd got lots of other things on their minds, frankly, I say, in a completely destroyed neighborhood of Daraya. But this was important enough to give up 90 minutes to come in on a Monday evening. So the small ones, that's always going to be complicated. Of course, as we all know, those things do come from the top, though, it tends pretty much to be about power, and therefore the permissiveness that's created, either instructions to kill or the permissiveness to kill. But going back to the core of your question, which was on the imbalance, and you're probably right, I do use the word hypocrisy, though I try to use the word double standards and hypocrisy not too often because they're so obvious ones to grasp for. But in effect, I'm saying the same thing because I do often use the word of imbalance and selectivity, which frankly are the same thing, but they're just marginally less emotive. But what I also use is the image of Lady Justice, that's the basic thing on a courthouse, is like the scales are balanced. It's supposed to be not who has committed the crimes, but how serious were those crimes, instead of which we're seeing put in very, very blunt terms, I don't like those crimes, and I would like action to be taken about them, because that person, that leader, is someone who I am already uncomfortable with, and they are attacking my friends who are pro-European in Ukraine. On the one hand, supporting that, and then, which was very good, and I'm very glad that European voices were so, so strong and united. And then a year later, 18 months later, we saw when, after October the 7th, again, the atrocities of Hamas, which clearly need to be addressed, but what happened, international humanitarian law isn't about, oh, well, they did this, so therefore we're entitled to do that. I mean, that's an absolute basic. Everybody knows that. And the leaders who pretend different, they know perfectly well that the fact that those crimes have been committed has nothing to do with your permissiveness to therefore also kill tens of thousands of civilians yourself. It's like, that's not rocket science, to put it mildly. So that difference, obviously Palestinians have lost out as a result of that imbalance. But the argument I make in the book is that Ukrainians have also lost out at one remove in ways that you partly described there. So when the invasion was happening, there's a brilliant, brilliant speech, which is findable, by the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations in New York, who talked about this. It was just as the invasion was about to happen, but we could see it was on its way. And he talked about it in imperial terms. He said, we have suffered from those powers which have imperial ambitions for our country. We Africans know about this. We need to put a stop to this. And this should not be happening. He did a sideswipe at the same time of others who'd ignored international law with a kind of indirect mention of the Iraq war. But his main point was, this is imperialism, we know it, we've suffered it, we're not having this. After October the 7th, that speech, and there were many other countries, broadly, Ukraine had global support. It was more in Europe and North America than in the rest of the world, but Latin America was very strongly in favor, and within Africa as well. It really wasn't controversial. But then, after 7th of October, when these same countries saw that Paris and London and Berlin and Brussels and all these others were refusing to speak on sometimes identical crimes to ones that had been committed, destruction of infrastructure, starvation of Mariupol, and then Gaza, lots of things, direct things which were already mentioned in the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant, and which quite rightly Ursula von der Leyen and others, head of the European Commission and others, had strongly condemned with lots of vivid adjectives, all of which I welcome, but when exactly the same thing happened. And I say, obviously the Palestinians lost from the failure for the rest of the Western world to stand up in that way and kept biting their lip rather than properly criticizing Netanyahu, leaving the poor Israeli civil society who were trying to say things completely beleaguered, by the way. But it also had bad knock-on effects. So that imbalance, I hope that imbalance is now recognized in a way that perhaps 2 years ago it was not sufficiently recognized. There's a slightly sterile debate that can be had about whether it's genocide or crimes against humanity, because as those of you who've studied these things will know, actually it's a fairly technical difference between those two. And to illustrate that point, the Khmer Rouge killing of 2 million people in Cambodia can only be described as genocide for a very, very technical reason, which is that Vietnamese were partly targeted within that. If the Vietnamese had not been part of the picture, this horrendous mass killings and acts of brutality by the Khmer Rouge would, quote unquote, only be crimes against humanity, which includes all these things of starvation and extermination and various other crimes against humanity. But even if we leave that sterile conversation to one side, in the meantime, not just Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, but also the magnificent Israel human rights group, B'Tselem, published a report with, it gives me goosebumps each time I look at it, Our Genocide was the title of the B'Tselem report. That is a powerful, powerful title, and how Western politicians can ignore, or if you like, scorn the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem and also Physicians for Human Rights. And then later after that came the UN Commission of Inquiry, a very important body chaired by a former UN Human Rights Commissioner, who is herself the former head of the Rwanda Criminal Process. So at that point, it doesn't really matter which word you're choosing. If many of you will have read Philip Sands' East-West Street, Lauterpacht and Lemkin, Lauterpacht, crimes against humanity, Lemkin, genocide. Choose either of those words, but that's what's happening. And I think that now anyone who says, oh, how dare you say such terrible things, that is an outrage, kind of needs to look at themselves, needs to really, really, really look in the mirror. Netanyahu, in that sense, does not, of course, look in the political mirror. He feels able to use the deeply insulting phrase blood libels whenever anyone is criticizing. He reaches back to the darkest history of anti-Semitism and the dark killings which Europeans were committing. And he reaches for that. He knows that he's lying. But other politicians need to call him out. And that imbalance is there at the moment still. We have seen the British and other government, various governments have now spoken out more strongly, but I think that needs to be much clearer. And if it's not, all the things that you described in your question will be there, a kind of resentment of like, oh, that's your justice, is it? And that would be, in addition to Trump's pressures, that would be another reason for the International Criminal Court to kind of, I hope this is not the case, but potentially implode. If it doesn't have the supporters of other governments, then obviously it can't survive. Which would be dark.
To think about.
Which would be dark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just sneak in a last question before I hand over to our audience. And given that we are at a university, almost like an essay-like question, and that is, through your work, through your experience in the field, through your interactions that you've had with victims, with survivors, but also through your advocacy work, what does justice mean? How should we think about what is justice?
Yeah. I mean, thanks again. It's lovely to be in this room, and I'm guessing there are many people in this room who come from places where they or their families or their others in that country have had experience of some of the terrible human rights violations which are happening in so many places across the world. And I think that what I've learned, partly also while writing this book actually, but before writing the book as well, is to remember how very different those forms of justice can be. So when I was at Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, for a long time, the main focus, which was right in some ways because it was picking up on Nuremberg and that kind of impossible thing that we discussed earlier, but was about international criminal justice and accountability. And the title of the book is still focused on that in a sense, Prosecuting the Powerful. But underneath the umbrella of that, the first thing that I would say, which I always understood to be important, and I guess all of us understand instinctively is important, is simply truth. Now, sometimes truth has been seen as an alternative to full accountability. South Africa is the most famous case where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was like, well, if you admit to the things that you have done, then that's fine. We'll move on, as it were. It is, as many of you will be aware, it's quite controversial in South Africa as well. But what is, I think, very interesting and really so interesting example for the world is Latin America, where in many different countries, be it Argentina and Chile most obviously, but Guatemala and others, truth commissions have been a door opener. And those who were involved in the crimes, of course, tried to bring in amnesty, saying, okay, been there, done that, civilian rule, but nothing more is going to happen. And that might last for a while, as most all in the room will know, the arrest of Pinochet, the Chilean military leader here in London, was really important of changing things in 1998. It kind of opened doors of thinking in a way, including at home in Chile, although he went back to Chile. So truth, really important. And I see that as being really a close first cousin. Frankly, it's kind of a sibling, but it's a close first cousin at absolute minimum, because the truth enables you to say, well, if that many crimes were committed and we can agree that those crimes were committed, then there needs to be consequences. The consequences then, as any of you who are studying these things will know, I don't go into it, this is very much not a kind of encyclopedia type of book, but there's reparations, there's all sorts of different ways you can deal. All of those are important. And in the Balkans, for example, an area that I know well and that you know very well, Bosnia, for example, there's lots of grittiness over unfinished business. And so justice can mean different things to different people. And I was struck by that with the meeting in Syria that I mentioned. But I think that the one that I would put top of the list is truth, because the denial of truth, which we're seeing big time, of course, both from Putin and from Netanyahu. I mean, both of those, they lie so brazenly, and you have very brave Russian media outside the country. Inside the country is basically impossible. In Israel, it's still a working democracy in some respects. Manages to put its own prime minister on trial for domestic corruption. That's the definition of a democracy. And it does have brilliant media which speak the truth, which, if you're not familiar with, I really encourage. Something like Haaretz, the Israeli daily, and Plus 972 magazine, both telling the truth day after day after day in Israeli voices, and 972, well, Israeli and Palestinian, but very much with an Israeli perspective as well. So those truths, I think, are very, very important as the sine qua non, as the precursor. Without that truth, you can't really get to the other stuff. And the rest, each country works out what will work. And that's a very, very, very active conversation that Syria is having. And just as a small, I know we want to go to Q&A quite rightly, on Syria, it's more postscript. What we discussed earlier, the imbalance, is a very big discussion point, because we obviously want to prosecute Assad's people, but by the way, there were jihadi crimes as well. So that's a big conversation. And you can't leave that lot out. You need to deal with crimes in the round. So dealing with it in the round, I suppose, is my summary. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think these questions have prompted even more. So we have a roving mic, just one. We'll open the floor now. If you'd like, let us know. raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. And when you get the mic, and if you could please introduce yourselves first. Thank you. Okay.
I'm Vesna Popovsky. I'm at the European Institute here at LSE. My question is very much connected with how you opened your discussion here today, which is, and you finished in a certain way, with thinking about different visions of justice. And I would like, if it's possible, and then you added that it was very much connected with your travels to Ukraine, Israel, West Bank, and Syria these days. So I would like to hear a little bit more about these different visions, especially in the way you define justice now as the truth, you know, or first cousin of justice. Truth.
Yeah. I mean, I'm conscious that I slightly gave a fuzzy answer to Denisa's question already, and I guess that I would still give a slightly fuzzy answer to you as well, because I do think that it would be really wrong for me as the outsider to give prescriptions. And I'm really interested when the society finds its voice. So I'm involved with a Balkan organization called the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, BIRN, which kind of, I'm seeing there, not close up because I'm not there at the moment, but so many kind of gritty things which are there so many decades after the main conflict was over, and also seeing the instability that's caused when those gritty bits are there. So I think that in different places, those grittinesses will be addressed in different ways. That the Syria prescription, for example, will almost certainly be different from the Ukraine one. What I admired so much, and I describe this within the book, but I'm just full of admiration. Ukrainian prosecutors are doing good work, I think. The International Criminal Court has investigators which are there on the ground. But I was incredibly interested by really what was pretty much unique, I think, in history, partly because the Russian forces, Putin's forces, were driven out very quickly, as we all remember, in the first months of the war. So you could go to on fresh battlefield stuff. Sometimes they ran and they left their paperwork behind, and you could work out. And you had Ukrainian non-governmental organizations, Ukrainian civil society, risking their lives again and again and again to be really close to the front line, sometimes really like a few hundred yards, because they might come back in again, so we need to grab this paperwork while they can. And there's a whole bunch, it was a bit unfair to name check, but Truth Hounds is one of the Ukrainian organizations, but there are many others doing similar work. Center for Civil Liberties, which won the Nobel Peace Prize, led by Alexander Matvichuk, also doing amazing work. And all of those they often have slightly different visions. And I don't think it's for me to say, go in this direction, don't go in that direction. So the only one I'd say is, don't think that you just go, oh, we've been there, let's move on. And I am personally, I'm really interested to watch what happens. I haven't heard it very much so far, but I'm kind of waiting for it. On Gaza, at the moment, I think everything is so, if you like, flaky still, so uncertain still. But if we get some kind of stability, okay, thank goodness that we can start to rebuild, and let's forget all of that. Now, I think that would be a very, very wrong. It's kind of morally wrong, but it's also practically wrong. And I think that's the lesson that gets so left out, that it's not good for Israelis if the crimes now being committed are addressed. You know, the child, the 10-year-old or the 12-year-old or the 15-year-old who's lost so much, their family, their parents, their home, and have no schooling and all of those things, where are they going to be in 10 years' time? And Syria, although I kind of knew it, was very, very interesting for me to hear that rawness. I was there only 5 months after the fall of Assad. And as those who've been reading the newspapers, you'll be aware, huge massacres, of course, have happened in the meantime in Syria. Everybody I spoke to said, the reason is, a Syrian minister said this to me. She said, it's the justice deficit. Sorry, the justice delay, she said. We, the government, need to put things in place, because until you get neighbor killing neighbor and blaming them because of this and that and this and that, and the more you leave it. So I'm sorry that's not a kind of concrete, but on that list, which many of you guys will be studying of the different forms of justice, all of which have their value. For me, I consciously didn't go into, well, this is more important than that, but I think it's a really interesting palette. And all that must be there is that sense of acknowledging truth and taking some kind of action, and society tells what kind of action is needed. So, yeah. Yes, exactly. Thank you. But thank you for the question, which is really important.
Any more questions in the room? Yes, so we will now take a group of questions. So we have one right there, and then Mike can go to the back.
Thank you very much. It was a very pleasure to hear you. I am Maya from Argentina. I am doing my LLM here at LSE, and I'm specializing on criminal law. And I worked back home at the Federal Criminal Court. So I was thinking about this link between justice and looking for truth. And I was thinking also about how the right to truth was imported from the international human rights field to the international criminal law field. And in that way, to foster maybe the victim prosecutorial powers in the criminal proceedings for atrocity crimes. So we know that in the ICC, it's quite limited because of this hybrid system, but then we look around under universal jurisdiction cases, for instance, and we see that private plaintiffs, victims as private plaintiffs can bring many war criminals and such to trial. So I was wondering, what are your views on victims' participation on criminal proceedings to, if we think it as something to fulfill the right to truth, and how could we get over any kind of revenge justice problems that might be there a little bit around, and also being careful with the due process, all the due process aspects, let's say. Thank you.
Thank you for, again, a really important question. Argentina, which I only briefly name-checked earlier, but as you know very well, and I encourage others to be aware, played such a historic role. So Argentina, like other countries in Latin America, went through that darkness. But even as I said it earlier, of this being the first stuff that happened, I was thinking, well, you're cheating slightly, because actually Argentina had this historic trial in 1985, and a great film, Oscar nominated as far as I remember, that was about that. I love the fact that someone only a few years ago could make a film about a trial on war crimes, like 40 years ago. And it's a great film, and that one of the assistant prosecutors then became the first chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. So thank you for your question. Thank you. Argentina's role, so interesting to watch. Argentina was top of my list of regrets that I didn't travel. I did quite a lot of traveling while writing, but didn't go to Argentina. It has so much to contribute to the understanding, and came up a lot in my conversations in Syria, actually, also, of like, they were interested in drawing on the knowledge of others on where on earth do we go from here. But your question about victim participation is a really important one. And I feel that's a journey which everybody has been on in the past 20 years, definitely, and probably especially in the past 10 years. The International Criminal Court, when it started, it was historic, but it was created by a bunch of lawyers, and human rights organizations had pressed for it themselves, lawyers. It's kind of like, we will do it and we will give it and it will happen. And treating it a bit with, unsurprisingly, I mean, Nuremberg was, after all, completely inventing everything on the hoof, but like, you have all these lawyers and then you bring in somebody who gives a speech, and you hope that person who has suffered terrible things will make an important speech. But they were being moved around on the board. That sense of agency has changed. And it's, even with the tribunals, with the Yugoslavia tribunal and the Rwanda tribunal, which were the setting the foundations, if you like, for the ICC, it was all a bit problematic because people felt excluded. And now there is much more sense that, to use the old cliche, but it's a very powerful phrase, and it's accurate, of course, nothing about us without us. And that is kind of true. It's used often in other contexts, obviously, of disabilities and so on. But it's also, I think, true of the victims of atrocity crimes or the relatives of those, of the ones who have directly been impacted. And I think there is a good understanding of that. And there are a number of key trials which are now building that thinking in ways that I think are really important. If I were to say, if I'd ask two most important developments, since the ICC and et cetera, in the positive sense, that would be one. And the other, which we haven't discussed at all, but just to toss in as a thought, is corporate crimes, which were completely invisible once upon a time. It was all about the state and what the state had done, or armed groups, Islamic State, for example, but others, Congolese groups and so on, so militia groups. But in the meantime, that sense that corporates can be held accountable, I think, is really important. But that's away from your question. On the question of victim participation, I think it's really, it's a very important change and it's an important development. Yeah, so thank you.
My name's Peter. I'm a freelance journalist. You made the leap from journalism into what you do now. Many parts of the media have been criticised for how they've covered certain conflicts, certain humanitarian disasters. In June, Yoav Gallant, who you mentioned, there was an arrest warrant issued for him by the International Criminal Court. He was given space in the Times to write an opinion piece alongside Niall Ferguson. We talked a lot about truth. How relevant is the British media still in kind of delivering that truth to people, do you think?
Gosh, yeah, you can see you've kind of flown with the question, because I think there's lots of things that, as was clear, I'm a former journalist myself, and in fact, I've now started to call myself a journalist again. Having done 20 years, it's like, well, actually, that's kind of what I am doing, is author and journalist. Is now what my card says, because I'm not in the NGO world, although I still feel part of it. But both for NGOs and for any of the rest of us, you want those truths to be told. There've been problems with media reporting, and you gently kind of alluded to the fact of, like, when should you be giving a voice to those people who clearly don't deserve to be heard, or is it important? So Putin was quite controversial. He had a big New York Times opinion piece a few years ago before the full-scale invasion, but it was already controversial then. But you think, well, it's quite interesting to hear what Putin's got to say in some ways. And so on the comment piece, I'm not sure that I have a very strong view, because I think it's kind of interesting, as long as you're hearing other views, to hear what the bad guys think. But as regards British media, I feel there are a lot of individuals who are trying to do their best in telling really complicated stories and continue, to some extent, to risk their lives. There are some media who are clearly doing that picking and choosing of which crimes should be addressed. But to take one which has been massively discussed in recent weeks, and months, the BBC, although I'm critical of some of the decisions that the BBC has taken, I also think that the BBC has done some really important reporting and has had some extremely excellent reporters who have been able to do it. They have not been suffocated as such. They do have to dance very carefully around the language that they are using, but they find ways. I think the best reporters at the BBC find ways of saying really important things which need to be said. And most in the room will be aware of the particular notable example of one where the BBC refused in the end to put out, in the form that had been made, a really powerful one about killing medical staff and doctors. And that was supposed to be, I think it's supposed to be a panorama anyway, it's going to be that big BBC one. And then eventually the BBC lost their nerve and tried to suffocate the fact they'd lost their nerve. That's what I have least respect for. Tried to suffocate the fact that they had lost their nerve, but it ended up being shown on Channel 4 television, and many in this room may well have seen it, or worth watching, otherwise Doctors Under Fire, I think was the title eventually. and it was shown in the United States under a different title. So all of those things is like, that's pretty cowardly to back off. But I feel that there's been important coverage in a number of the main papers. And actually in the book, I quote Financial Times and a senior UN official. Financial Times had a very powerful editorial basically saying you cannot be silent any longer. So I'm not of the category of saying, oh, journalists refuse to tell the truth. I don't think that's true. I can also see how difficult it is when you get assaulted, I mean, not necessarily physically, but in ways that make it extremely difficult to work by government leaders which accuse you of prejudices which that journalist clearly does not hold. I mean, I'm obviously not really speaking code. I mean, the kind of, I've already said before, blood libels. I mean, it's an outrageous phrase for Netanyahu to use, an outrageous phrase that anybody, however distinguished that person may be, and including if they're Israeli themselves, it will use the word, throw this word around. So that's a long answer to your question on media. I feel that, of course, media has a responsibility to tell the truth as fearlessly as it can. I think within the British media, it's divided, but then British media has always been divided. That would be my personal take.
Okay, we will be taking questions from the room in a minute. So there is one here, but we also have questions online. So Laura, do you want to? You can read 2 or 3 questions. So,
Okay.
yeah.
This question is from Region from Tasmania, Australia. One of the things I loved about Prosecuting the Powerful was the stories of the many people around the world, academics, journalists, and survivors, who have bravely fought to document and speak out about the crimes of the powerful. Was it part of your aim in writing the book to pay tribute to those people and support their work? Thank you. Anthony, LSE external alum, asking, is the ICJ under pressure? On Israel-Palestine, it has issued preventive orders, is in the genocide case, and 2, UNGA requested advisory opinions on the illegal occupation and Israel's obligation to allow UN and NGOs to work in Palestinian territories. So basically, is the ICJ under pressure? That's currently.
Okay, so those
two?
Those two.
Yeah, sure. Both good questions. Thank you for that first question for Australia. Was it part of my aim? Yes, it absolutely was. It sounds as though, thank you for already having read the book, and I'm glad if you found it engaging. That was definitely one of my thoughts, which became even stronger while I was writing it. So I say 4 times I visited Ukraine. And it was like, whoa, you guys are really amazing. And then realizing that was happening already, as mentioned, former Yugoslavia again, I'm involved with colleagues who are continuing even now. It's sometimes risky, it's sometimes quite difficult, the work they're doing. But certainly in those other places, believing that those risks are fundamentally worth taking because of the greater good. And there was one Ukrainian NGO colleague who said, I will continue this work until for the rest of my life. And she's like in her 30s. It's like, well, I hope that it won't quite take that long, actually. But that sense of this is for the long haul. And going back to my Poland experience, which obviously is very formative, things that you see when you're just starting out, they do stick with you for obvious reasons. And the fact of a whole country going like, no, this is not acceptable. We actually want something to change. And then things did change. I see so many parallels in the work that's being done. So thank you for picking up. Yes, paying tribute to those amazing people in different places is definitely part of it. And I'm glad if people feel inspired by that. And also that sense of, even when things are dark, believing that each of us can make that difference in creating a bit of change. Anthony, thanks for the question on the International Court of Justice as well. I don't claim to have any inside knowledge on the ICJ and where it is at the moment, but glad to address it because we haven't discussed it at all this evening as you guys will know, it's the other place in The Hague which is so important at the moment. So you have the International Criminal Court dealing with individuals and crimes potentially committed by the Prime Minister of here or the President of there. And those are very important in one way. The International Court of Justice, the Intergovernment Court, which was kind of working in the shadows to some extent for many years, even though it's important, but came out of the shadows with that key case that South Africa brought at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024. And so, Anthony, in your question, you already listed some of those key things. So some it's just been provisional calls that they have made, and some they have already issued advisory opinions, which are their final opinions, which are also very important. It may, quote unquote, only be an opinion, but the kind of language that a large number of thoughtful judges in the world's most important court have found. Netanyahu, because he's Netanyahu, of course, starts talking about blood libels again. But fundamentally, we have the most respected judges in the world who have come out with these things. So those are incredibly important. Are they under pressure? I'm sure they are, in the same way that the ICC, much more visibly, has been under pressure. But as far as we can see, it's doing its work pretty much fearlessly. And I think probably what it has in common, one thing it has in common with the ICC is they don't like judges, quite rightly, don't like being shouted at by politicians, especially when they're having lies shouted at them. And I may be wrong, I'm seeing this on the outside, but I feel many people thought, oh, they've been so bold, they won't be bold again. But actually, they've continued to be bold. And I think that it's at least possible, I'm completely speculating here, but that the brazenness of Netanyahu and some of his friends may or may not have affected the thinking. Of course, they're fundamentally looking at the law, they're fundamentally looking at all those things, and what politicians are saying shouldn't have any effect. But I don't think that Netanyahu does himself any favors by telling such lies. As a small, tiny detail, Lauterpacht, Herr Lauterpacht, who, as those who've read East West Street, or indeed in this book as well, created the phrase or revived the phrase for the importance of it at Nuremberg, Crimes Against Humanity, which is so important for our understanding of international law today. He was himself a judge at the International Court of Justice, an important British judge at the International Court of Justice. A not very well-known fact, but one that I love and only discovered while writing the book, is that he also happens to be the great uncle of today's president of Israel, President Herzog, who has been quoted by the International Court of Justice because he both reveres his great uncle, in words at least, but basically tramples on his great uncle's legacy. So that's one of many small ironies. But yeah, the ICJ really important. I don't know what the pressures are, but so far, at least, I think we've seen really important things. The South Africa case has had lots of publicity, which is it genocide or is it not? Which that final decision will come later. But the other ones which were mentioned have had less attention and I think are very well worth looking at.
We had a question here. Okay, so let's now do a bigger round. So yes, so 2 there and 1 there. Yeah? Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this evening. I found it very interesting. Anatole Melnihansen, physician in London. Does the International Criminal Court have a statute of limitations? And is there any appetite to look at big wars like the Iraq War, for example, and Western leaders?
So statute of limitations, basically not. The Iraq War, nothing can be retrospective. So there are actually some, as I've made clear before, I'm the non-lawyer, so I can quickly, lawyers can start correcting me. There are some important judgments, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, which is why actually what happened in Iraq was kind of also Britain's responsibility in some ways, also became a European thing. For things that happened during the Iraq War. So I suppose that on the Iraq War, there are 2 separate issues. Was the invasion legal or not? And I think it's pretty easy to say, no, it wasn't. And Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, has said that clearly in the meantime, and everyone else agrees. And the senior legal advisor of the Foreign Office resigned on that point. It was clear to to all that without that proper UN authorization, it was not. And that's now a theme which is relevant for Ukraine. But all of these answers, sorry, the answer is slightly muddy, things have changed. So the crime of aggression is now something, but at the time of the Iraq war was not. And as regards war crimes, they also would be more difficult to deal with under the International Criminal Court terms. There have, as we all know, been some British cases, although there's been a lot of skepticism about whether those have failed to address. We didn't mention, but it's important for those who are not aware, because it's kind of an absolute core element of the International Criminal Court, is that rather legalese phrase complementarity, is that the ICC only comes into play if the country which has, if the country which has committed those crimes is failing to prosecute them themselves. And so this comes up very often in the context of Israel, for example. Surely it's democracy if they can do it themselves, to which the answer is, yeah, they can, as they've seen with corruption, but like they're not on war crimes. But if at any point, say for the sake of argument, after Netanyahu was gone, there seemed to be signs that actually Israel was ready to hold the worst people to account, as for example, Germany did, 20 years after the war especially, with Auschwitz trials and other. If that were to happen, the ICC would give up. So that complementarity, which we haven't discussed, is a really important underlying. But going back to your immediate question about Iraq, I think those things are retrospective. Statute of limitation doesn't really count, but looking backwards is a key thing. It's only after a particular country has become part of the court that you can move forward, which means that Assad's crimes, for example, would be way more difficult to prosecute, because even if the new Syria were to join the court, which may well happen, they're in good conversations with The Hague, it would be hard to push the clock backwards.
Okay, so we'll take two questions here. And we have one more over there. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the explanation and all, the arguments that you gave. My name is Wajdi. I'm from Tunisia. I'm working with iWatch organization, and we did a lot of work with Human Rights Watch actually in Tunisia. So my question is, this is like classical one, but still controversial. Can you still consider the use of violence morally justified by liberation movements? And here, like talking about the case of Gaza, and can we consider it as a form of justice? And what kind of justice that you think could serve, the Palestinian case, if we not consider that as a form of justice?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Shall we take the other question?
Yeah, sure.
Well?
Yeah.
So you could just pass the mic. Sorry. It was just right here. Yeah. And then we'll take the third question because we are.
Yeah. Fine.
Can you hear me? Should I be? My name is Alina. I'm studying culture and conflict here at LSE, and I'm also included in war crimes conversation in Ukraine. And so my question is regarding Ukraine. I'm pretty much hopeless, I would say, regarding justice, regarding specific crimes, as many people are in Ukraine. And so my question is, what's next, as I believe local authorities are not doing enough, as there are exchanges of war criminals and the sentences are in absentia. Then tribunals established by Council of Europe is not going to go for ruling trio. And Amnesty in the peace deal, the one that was published, leaked, kind of shows that for Russia it's important to have impunity. For United States it's not important enough to have justice. So what is there any option actually? Because regional, international doesn't really work, local also, and then it seems like it's a negotiating point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll just take the last question, which was at the back. And that will be the last question that we will take tonight.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for the talk. It was great. I'm Hallie, and I am an independent researcher. I'm a previous partner manager at a hyperscaler. My question is more about what the general public can do, just so that we have some immediate steps to take from this talk. So I think that we've seen ordinary people using, specifically now, the power of technology and social media to find justice themselves. And from your experience, having seen it firsthand, from transitions from dark periods of time to lighter ones, how can we as the general public sway the pendulum towards the lighter side? How can we increase the the, I guess, like the speed in which we've reached the, the bright side.
Thank you. What a great set of questions. Thank you. So violence morally justifiable. I can see how there's a kind of practical and a moral one. I can see how in practical terms people end up thinking we've tried non-violence, it's not going anywhere, so all we've got left is violence. I have always argued, and you see, you mentioned a couple of the earlier books I wrote, which are about peaceful protests and stuff, and in those I was arguing as well, like, the guys who've got the guns who are running the country, they're always going to have more guns than you are. So what that tends to lead to is huge bloodshed, and the non-violent actually is at least as courageous and sometimes can create more change. But even if we overstep that and take, okay, but like they're doing all of this killing, we have to kill back. I think the point that I have found is really misunderstood, and I actually tell the story in the book of how somebody walked out of a press conference. I was involved with a Human Rights Watch report on suicide bombings, and we launched it in Ramallah in 2004, I think. I can't remember actually exactly, but anyway, around then, beginning of the century. And somebody stood up and said, but don't you know that under international law you can do everything if, because they've done so many bad things. And I was just starting to give the answer because the reporter had addressed it at significant length and he'd already walked out, which always stuck with me as interesting. Because the truth, as I'm sure you're aware, is that, and it's kind of, again, it's instinctively obvious, that violence against, so taking an easy moral thing in the Second World War, then were occupied Poles allowed to take up arms against the occupying Germans? Like, of course they were. So that, leaving that one to one side, what you don't have, both morally and legally, but also the practicalities, is believing that you can go around killing civilians, whether that's at, wedding parties or bus stops, this, that, and the other, or indeed, at a peace and love music festival, for heaven's sake, was one of the places I visited. It was obviously a deeply, will affect me if I wasn't even there, I was there months later. But to visit that scene where those people had gathered and then they were just slaughtered in their own, the idea that that could somehow be, oh, well, they've already done that, and so therefore we can do that, is of course the exact mirror image, the precise mirror image of the arguments that Netanyahu and his cohorts are using, that we can do all of this killing and starvation and plans for ethnic cleansing, because look what they did on that day on 7th of October. So both in moral and in legal terms, there is zero idea that because they've done this, you can also do that. So the civilian bit, as you will certainly be aware, is core to all of the Geneva Conventions, core to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and so on. And the question of violence is a muddier one. I would still argue that wherever possible, actually non-violent is kind of the more productive one. And it brings world opinion and all of those things. But the bit which for me is immovable is it okay to blow up people at a music festival because their government has done something horrible? For me, that's obviously not, just as you can't blow up an apartment block or thousands of apartment blocks because it's horrible. So that would be my take on that. But Tunisia, just to say, the amazing things that Tunisia talk about opening up the world as well back in 2011 in different ways, and led to so much else. What kind of justice was Irina's question, where there are so many difficulties? You're quite right to address that, and you obviously, from Ukraine, you understand the issues. We haven't discussed the crime of aggression tribunal, which the Ukrainians argued for, and had huge difficulty getting international agreement. It looked as though it was almost there, and then it fell off again. Gaza, again, distracted in some ways, I think, and speaking to people who were involved in those conversations. Anyway, it's now supposed to be agreed, as you know, but it still hasn't got the money, so it's still kind of sitting there like an empty vessel, if you like. As you'll be well aware, for Ukrainians, it really matters, the idea that this is a leadership tribunal. The other ones, you're quite right, you address some of the points. Crimes addressed in absentia, I kind of feel uncomfortable with those because they're not really, quote, proper justice in some ways. It's a bit kind of slapdash. But I can see why Ukraine has done them. I really hope, I think the most important part of your question for me is the one you came to at the end, is Russia really doesn't want it to happen, and America doesn't kind of give an expletive deleted, or the current president certainly doesn't. And so there, the point would be the same one I made about Gaza, is that if what all of us hope, when we get some kind of peace on the ground in Ukraine, with some kind of political justice of what happens, not giving away the whole country, there's still the big question of what happens next. The third one, thank you. What can we do? I guess it's to some extent implicit in some of the other things I said earlier, but mostly we need to believe that we can do something, that our voices individually and collectively matters. All of the cliches are true, you know, pebbles on the beach, but it makes the whole thing. I mean, each of these things together makes a difference. And I described my own history of seeing that in real life. The Arab Spring was another case. I mean, darkness since then, but what was achieved then briefly was important. And in the privileged context that we are here in this country in London, but also in many other countries around the world, never underestimate how much politicians, even when they seem not to be listening, are actually listening. We do have that control of the ballot box. And if you talk to any member of parliament, both in this country, but in any country which is a parliamentary democracy, they notice their mailbox. Now, if they get 2 emails on a subject, they may ignore it. If they get 20, I'm not sure. If they get 200, they will definitely be thinking. If they get 2,000, then they just know they have to think about that subject. So silence by any or all of us is what allows things to be ignored. That is true of different places, you know, Sudan, which has been, we've not really discussed today, and at least in closing, we need to mention horrendous crimes, a horrendous number, but it hasn't made it onto the political agenda. And that's because collectively, we haven't cared enough about it. So human rights organizations and others, probably including in this room, have tried to raise them. But going back to what can we do, making our voices heard, that includes MPs, includes writing letters, and here, obviously, academic institutions. There are so many ways that your voices can be heard. And the fact that it may not have an impact like within 3 months, even within 3 years, remember that all of these things take much, much longer. Not always, sometimes it's almost instant, but do not think, oh, we've done that for 6 months and it didn't give anything. Things will take time. So don't lose belief on that. And I know that those in this room and I hope others listening online as well can feel some of that. So, yeah.
Steve, thank you very much for this very, very rich discussion. And I think what I quite enjoyed reading your book and tonight is the way that you tackle these issues that are so easy to become binary with such nuance, complexity, but never compromising on addressing injustice. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for listening and for your questions. Do check out Steve's book. It's a wonderful read, and it reads easily as well. That means that's meant as a compliment. You can get all the big messages so nicely, and very, very much mirrors a lot of stuff that is much harder to read on transitional justice that we read in the academic setting. The book is sold outside if you're interested in a copy, but we will also be ordering a copy for the library. So there will be other options to check it out. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to future conversations.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.